Hello, world. My name is Gerry Fialka. It's January 31, 2021. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here with Clinton Ignatoff, who's facilitating and hosting this evening. And it's a real honor and a pleasure to be here with Cameron McEwen of McLuhan'sNewSciences.com. What an amazing website. Thank you, Cameron, and thank you, Clinton.
My pleasure.
Glad to be here.
Great. You guys talked at the exact same time. That's called complex clairvoyance. We know that. So I'm just going to start off with a little intro. And I had an adventure this morning walking in a back alley in Venice, California, and I saw a raccoon, and he looked up at me, and I looked at him, and I wondered what he was thinking. And that was anthropomorphizing the word thinking onto this animal. So I thought, well, maybe he thinks I'm bigger than him or smaller. Who knows? And often when I ask questions, when we're doing tetrad analysis in our groups, if a certain topic, a certain invention is more innate or more invented, meaning, is a tree more innate or more invented? Who knows? A tree is nature. We did not invent it. It's on the earth without human beings, but we can make lumber out of trees. So on these McLuhan mashups, we try to talk in layperson's terms and not highbrow academia. So I'm just going to start with real basic. The word thinking etymologically comes from imagine, conceive, in the mind, consider, meditate, cause to appear to oneself. The root could be the word to feel. And that's also the root for the word thought and think. So first question, gentlemen, we'll start with you, Cameron. Is thinking more innate or more invented?
I guess I would have to say that it's importantly both. So
sounds good to me. You want to expound on that a little, or that's it?
No, I mean, it's the sort of question that you'd have to think about for some time, and that would doubtless have many arguments to be considered on both sides. But I think thinking is one of those things that probably has defined humans from the very start, but it's also become very much more complex simply because of the environment that humans have created for it.
Beautiful. And Clinton, thinking more innate or more invented?
Yeah, I would err on the side of invented. If you think of it as something a little more systemic or systematic, I mean to say, than just perception in the raw. The invention of thinking would sort of be, I think, what differentiates us from other animals.
Right, because was that raccoon thinking when he looked at me? We got eye contact, but I don't know because I don't speak raccoon language, and do they even have language? So I'm going to ask one more, and I appreciate this time with both you gentlemen. Alan Watts says, if you acknowledge your enemy, you empower them. Marcel Duchamp says that there is no solution because there's no problem. So why do we really have to uncover the hidden psychic effects of our inventions? Aren't we just empowering the invention to overrun us, or whatever verb you want to put in there, manipulate us, or, become android memes of us, or whatever? Why do we have to uncover these hidden psychic effects of our inventions? Cameron.
Well, for the same reason that it's helpful to figure out the causes of diseases or the causes of other infirmities of individuals and societies, that it gives you some chance of ameliorating their downsides.
Brilliant, Cameron. Thank you so much, because you're talking in layperson's terms and not highbrow academia, and that's what we're all about at McLuhan Mashups. In fact, we're going to retitle the name of our series to McLuhan Mock-Up, McLuhan Make-Up, and McLuhan Matchup. So, Clinton, you can answer the question, why do we have to uncover these hidden psychic effects, and take over as host. Thank you so much.
Uncovering the psychic effects is well, it's also taking on responsibility, and it's you're not coasting or going with the flow or drifting with the wind when you actually try to determine what it is that is running the show, so to speak. Right? What is running the show here? Are we working within parameters which are confined and constricted, which lead to technological determinism? I think the answer is sometimes. But then, who do you want to let assume the power over the technology to then wield it? The paper I just released for New Explorations Journal tries to look at how I'm reading earlier McLuhan stuff in the 1940s that I'm getting from the archives here in Ottawa about, how he really saw, captains of industry or big businessmen or megalomaniacal, personalities, tough guys who, matched a Superman comic book sort of idea of being big bruisers throwing their weight around using technology and money, and there's a sort of stepping into the role of the absolute in a materialist Hegelian sense, is the way McLuhan puts it. And since there's always going to be those people, and since you want to keep tabs on that sort of thing, that's why it's really important to know what's really running the show, and how to maybe sidestep or escape the environment, or just be led around by the nose otherwise. Cameron, have you? Oh, sorry. If you have any thoughts first.
Well, what I wanted to do is I wanted to suggest that, at least for my taste, it would be better if we had more of a dialogue form going on. So
let's.
For example, when we're talking about the psychic consequences, it's unclear to me if that is the consequences in the psyche, or if it's the consequences caused by the psyche, right? Or both. And it just seems to me that as we talk, we want to try to, if not clarify points like that, we at least want to draw them out. Another example is when Gerry asked his first question, I answered it as if thinking was native to human beings, and human beings could not really be conceived as human beings without it. But when Clinton addressed the question, and this went back to Gerry's talk of the raccoon, I guess, the idea was that there might be something to thinking that was conceivably precedent to human beings, in which case then its nativity would be more stressed than its inventiveness, except that its inventiveness would then, to some degree, come to define humans. Now, all of that stuff that I've just been saying was doubtless not very clear, but I think if we were to talk back and forth with each other, we could make a stab at making it clear.
Absolutely. I think that would be a good protocol going forward. When you say psychic consequences, of course, I'll admit I automatically assumed it would be the effects on the psyche, although the consequences which come from the psyche, I wonder if there could be consequences that come from the psyche that are anything other than actions, like physical actions. Wow, we're getting pretty deep into a hole here, Gerry. What do you think?
First of all, Cameron, that was a beautiful way to integrate this conversation. And I generally say that stock line because it's sort of, and you being the great resource of where so many McLuhan lines came from, is I understood that he learned from Ezra Pound that artists are the intent of the race, and they're revealing the hidden psychic effects of our inventions so we can learn to cope with them. So to flip that whole psyche thing was brilliant of you, and I've never thought of it that way. My thing is, when I do tetrads with people, 4 or 5 times a week, I say, don't think, just use your impulse, your intuition, and your feeling. But in essence, I don't think humans can separate thinking from feeling. So if you go back to the etymology of the word, a thinking, the root is to feel. So, you think of thinking as being linear logic, and you think of feeling as being heartfelt and impulsive, or as Lily Tomlin says so well, reality's just a collective hunch. Like, I just have a hunch. I have a feeling that it might be this. Captain Beefheart said it best. I've had too much to think. But indeed, you can't separate, I don't believe, can you really separate thinking from feeling? Bridget Bardot says, when I make love, I don't think. I'm like, good luck. So can you really separate thinking from feeling? And is that what, you probably know, Cameron, the root, the etymological root of the word psyche, because I had the press write me up once and they changed it to psychic effects. I goes, no, I wrote it psyche. Then I says, well, I'll take whatever I get. But, can you really separate feeling from thinking? I don't know.
Well, just, if you ask if you can really separate, part of the difficulty of the question is the further question of what it is really to separate.
Yeah.
Right? So a lot of these questions are circular and multi-leveled, and anytime we're talking about McLuhan, we need to just keep in mind that the multi-levels of language and of being was a factor that he considered from the very beginning, but he didn't know how to contemplate it, and he didn't know its consequences. And what he did over his lifetime was sort of draw those things out.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent an excellent way to render the complexity of the subject of thinking and of being and of the integration of being and what it means to be a human in the sense that that I sort of think he observed that the mechanized people were not being. It's funny because Gerry's very self-aware sense. His questions always tend to have this ambiguity in them, and so he likes to throw out these questions that in and of themselves offer multiple interpretations of meaning. So it's very interesting to see you put your nose on precisely the imprecisions which are which are part and parcel of his questions. That's really refreshing, actually.
That's Cameron. It is really refreshing because Bob Dobbs would usually go, "That's a stupid question," and your social skills have you taking it a little deeper. Because I really appreciate your recent dialogues with Bob. They've been enlightening, deep delving, and he taught me this great line that goes something like, "Ambiguity is a sign of human maturity." I remember telling my dad that, and he was like, "That's an interesting line," because that's what there's no such thing as a stupid question. If I don't know something, that's because I don't know it. So I guess I'm stupid. And, you could say it's stupidity, or it's probing, or the two words I loved you saying, Cameron, was riddle and unriddle. How do we unlearn everything we know?
Yeah, but unriddle isn't just unlearning. It's also a key to learning.
Yeah, I agree.
As Socrates said early on, and as McLuhan more or less repeated when he said we had to probe our ignorance, knowing what you don't know is a very critical step in trying to know.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Just the gap. I that makes me think of some advice that I thought to give someone the other day who expressed the sentiment that they were finding so many answers that for a subject to write about for an academic thesis, that they started to lose what the question was, and so they weren't sure how to go about writing their paper because they were learning so much stuff so rapidly that they forgot what the question was, or what question they should be trying to answer to even frame it. And the best advice I could come up with was go and have conversations with your friends and random people, and go talk about this subject and find out where their ignorance begins and where it starts, and try to find out the questions that they're not answering, because the gap is where the action is, eh?
Yeah, and Marsha wasn't talking about the clothing store, but I did a tetrad on storytelling yesterday, and this woman's gone to Columbia, teaches poetry. This is a poet, published poet, and very bright young lady. And I says, "What does storytelling enhance?" And she said, "Restriction." Now, I thought that was sort of backpedaling and saying, I know there are disservices to storytelling, and people, the mystery of art is that we don't know if it activates or pacifies us, but we want to believe, like Cameron, you said with Bob, we want to believe in genuine thinking as opposed to meaninglessness. But at the same time, do we want to invest our hearts and souls in meaninglessness as much as we do in genuine thinking?
Well, there again, there are many varieties of meaninglessness. And I just go over to what Clinton was saying, that in probing, it is a very good idea to discuss with friends and strangers what strikes you as important, but what you're looking for is sort of some way of getting ahead. It's a little bit like you're lost in a city where you're not familiar with the surroundings, and you have to kind of feel yourself through the city in order to get somewhere. And that kind of navigation is sort of what it's all about. That's when an artist gets up in the morning and starts painting a little bit, or a poet putting a few words on paper, what they're trying to do is get ahead in that sense of probing their way.
When you say the city, when you talk about the city in that way, it immediately evokes for me the idea of the labyrinth, of course, finding your way through the labyrinth of cognition, maybe, as a metaphor for the larger project. I've always thought of that as the primary goal of McLuhan's science. Does that resonate with you?
If you're talking to me there, yes, absolutely. I mean, I could have said in a dark wood like Dante. I could have said the labyrinth in Crete, as you're saying. So for McLuhan, and I think this was part of his thing with Joyce, the human being is inherently flawed and inherently blind, and so you never get out of the this difficulty of feeling your way ahead. But there's nothing incompatible with feeling your way ahead in this more or less blind way, and science and truth. And the trick is to try to think those things together. And where earlier in our conversation there was some talk of false absolutes, I guess that was in reference to McLuhan's work in the 40s. People very often try to come down on one side or the other of feeling your way forward blindly and truth. Either life is only the one or life is only the other. But the difficulty is to think them together.
Yeah, that's very poignant. And I guess we don't need to go into all the labels McLuhan has for these dichotomies or his perceptions of their reoccurrence in all these various forms. The idea, though, for me, when I think about why media studies and why media expressly means study of all of our technology and all of our artificial environments, beginning with the spoken word and the garden, which is a cultivated corner of nature which is protected, all the way through to cities and what have you. What have you? When that's the object of study, I like to think of it as a means to get out of pure materialism, secular materialism. McLuhan's got all sorts of great zingers, wallowing in the sensuousness of being a robot or what have you. But you have to get through the material to get out of the material. So you have to study the media in order to then leave it behind. Like you have to learn how to tie your shoelaces before you can become a marathon runner. And the fact that people don't know what their world is made of, and it's the artist's injunction to show them what their world is made of, or teach them, to perceive the material forms we've created for ourselves, and their origins within human scale invention and creation, and not just as abstract applied know-how, set it and forget it, obsolete consumer devices. That's always been for me sort of the crux of what McLuhan was about. What does that jive with you, Cameron?
A little bit, but I need to ask some questions in order to really know. So from the very beginning of McLuhan's intellectual life, he was centrally concerned with language. And that's because his mother was a reader, and an impersonator, and she was constantly going around the house talking as if she were, you know, Yeats or Byron or Chaucer or Shakespeare or whoever.
Mm-hmm.
And the choice of English for McLuhan studies, especially as compared to philosophy, which one of his teachers was trying to push him in that direction. The choice of English had to do with the importance of language in his personal family life and in his sort of professional interests, so far as that had developed when he was in university. So he never, ever, as far as I know, got away from the mysteries and difficulties of language. And I guess what I would like to do is I'd like to ask about the relationship between what you were just saying in terms of material embodiment and of people trying to think their way out of constrictions. Is how do you see that related to language?
I see it in the way that language, our day-to-day language usage, relies on metaphors and well-proportioned analogies in our perception. So I always like to go back to when McLuhan wrote a letter to the cyberneticist Norbert Wiener and told Norbert Wiener, have you realized that the poet is like an electron valve, which is a tube, like in your guitar amp or your television, for those who might not know who are listening, or a transistor. And the way that a vacuum tube works is that there's a little plate between two electrical contacts, and when that plate gets electrified, it allows a much larger current to flow from, I think it's from the anode to the cathode, and it regulates the flow. So you've got a whole bunch of power that's backed up to this vacuum tube, and then the little bit of power that you feed into the third probe on the triode controls and modulates and regulates that massive current, turns it on and off. It becomes a switch, like the switch in your computer or whatnot. This is what amplifies the very subtle radio waves into the big loud sound coming out of your home stereo set, right? It is this modulation, this amplification. And so McLuhan told Norbert Wiener, the poet does this because by very precisely modulating mere words, the poet is adjusting and shaping the current and the stream of human culture itself, right? Shakespeare could write a play and change all of history and all of our thought by very precise, subtle modulations of just picking just the right word, right? So in this regard, you have to understand the technology at hand, in this case, the cutting edge vacuum tube, and B, understand how to perceive in its mechanical functioning something which is analogous to the role of the poet. And so understanding what your world is made of is useful for, well, it helps in the fact that we often rely on technological metaphors for understanding ourselves, be it, people, saying that the mind is a chariot and like a tarot deck, or we're under pressure and we have psychic drives, like we were, like as was said when Freud was developing psychoanalysis and whatnot. So understanding the technology helps a lot for then being able to use the technology as metaphor, I guess would be my answer.
Okay, so I'll just make a few comments that won't go into the meat of the thing, but I'll just note that the metaphor that he expressed to Wiener is something that he also wrote to Innes and to Pound. And what's interesting about that particular time in McLuhan's life, that is to say, roughly 1949 to 1952, let's say, is that he was beginning to become a structuralist. And so when you're talking about anode and cathode, you're talking about a variable relationship between two poles. And that variable relationship between two poles is the heart of computing. It's the heart of cybernetics, all things that McLuhan was getting interested in at the time. And he would then try to think how he could apply this to his longstanding interest in language. So when he had been at Cambridge, one of the things that Richards and Epson were particularly interested in were the varieties of ambiguity. So McLuhan, 15 years after he's finished with Cambridge, is beginning to wonder if the structural modulations between poles might be a way of coming to grips with the ambiguities of language. And in fact, I believe that 10 years further on, when he's finished with his National Association of Education Broadcasters project, that is say in 1960, I believe he's come to the idea that all media of any sort whatsoever are such modulating devices between poles, and that if we can understand the full range of those different modulations and understand how they can relate to each other, a little bit like a chemical compound or a chemical molecule, then we have a way of talking about language that may be able to answer problems that the whole Western tradition has never been able to answer.
Right. I think modulating between poles is very useful. A way to describe it, and it seems to be we're circling now back to the idea of groping and feeling your way through experience. Erasmus says that experience is the schoolmaster of fools, right? Compared to truth, perhaps truth rendered, albeit like conceptually, or truth as maybe a little practical or abstract or functional. Does that capture? Are we getting into the hot and cool dichotomy here?
Oh, I don't think we're getting into the hot and cool, no. Except that hot and cool are themselves poles that can be modulated in various ways. But what we are getting into is something that I might be seen as having talked about from the start of our conversation, and that is that once the model of modulations between poles is in place, and if literally anything can be considered along the whole spectrum of those modulations, then there is no such thing as coming to an answer, and especially not to some absolute answer. There only is the facts of those variations and the problems that those variations pose, and the potential solutions they may give. And I think what McLuhan particularly found when he started to read Gestalt psychology in 1964, with the idea that every figure has its ground and every ground has its figure, McLuhan was coming to see that there should be a way of dealing with these variations, which normally have been or ambiguities, I guess would be better to say, which normally are considered as problems, which might be his solution.
Mm-hmm. So to hammer down a finer point about this, maybe to render it a little more concrete to listeners, there's this sort of implicit conceit used today when we're talking about, say, people who have different learning styles, or one person is a more hands-on style of learner, and so first this person is of this particular constitution, and then second, now the classroom or the learning experience, there's a special sort of learning experience which is appropriate to them as a type. In some of the books I'm reading about computers in the classroom, some Piagetian psychologists come up with this idea of hard learning and soft learning. And so a young computer programmer who wants to plan the whole computer program in their head and draw it out and structure it and then write the program last beginning to end exactly from a top-down attack has a very hard learning style. Whereas the soft learner sits at the computer and they make a little program and then they figure it out and then they build from there, hodgepodge, and they don't know where they're going and they experiment and they sort of feel it out and flesh it out like they're building up a structure one at a time, and they're learning through experiment and mostly learning through failure and fixing their bugs and whatnot. So first, there is a sort of person of a particular constitution. Second, here's the right environment for them. I feel like McLuhan flips that around. He says he's got this very interesting inversion of that scenario where his technological determinism, as it's been called, says this sort of environment makes these sorts of people. That sort of environment makes those sorts of people. Is it as cut and dry as that, or am I missing something?
I feel like we may. Are we supposed to be just talking in dialogue here? Are we?
Yeah.
Gerry, are you wanting to come in, or?
I'm listening delightfully, and I will come in when I can. But that was great point that Clinton just made. That I would love to hear your reaction, Cameron. But I will come in. Clinton can see when I raise my hand, so I've come up with a few thoughts, and I'll bring them up when I can. Okay,
good. So anyway, so to come back to Clinton's question, I think that that is anything but clear in McLuhan, and it certainly isn't as I think you said simple or plain.
Cut and dry.
That's all that. Yeah, cut and dry. No, and because I mean the big problem is that once you begin to look into how the hard learner and the soft learner actually proceed, it's hard to maintain the distinction, right? And a great deal of what McLuhan is up to, and a great deal of what any great thinker is up to, is the question of how to maintain something, how to say something, how to argue for something that actually makes sense, that actually can hold out against its inherent weaknesses, you could say. So if you take the soft learner, the guy that's or the gal that's going ahead sort of step by step without a organized plan and trying to figure out where they're going to ultimately end up. Each one of those little steps doubtless involves some idea of what they're doing at the time. So you could say each of the steps of a soft learner involves some sort of hard learning, right? And then with the hard learner, although we can say in general that that person is trying to get from A to B, in order to get from A to B, they need to do a whole lot of soft steps.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
And so the model kind of falls apart, and the trick is always how to have something that is interesting, something that may achieve communication where communication is needed, something that feels like something that I need to work on.
Mm-hmm. Gerry, yeah.
Yeah, that was really good. I've read this McLuhan quote to people I've interviewed for years, and I usually interpret it in my words, and then I ask them what it means to them. And it might touch on a little of what you've just exchanged on. Everybody experiences far more than they understand. Yet it is experience rather than understanding that influences behavior. So I simply put it in a story. The kid comes in from the cold weather, and the parent goes, "Don't touch the stove to warm your fingers up. It will burn your hand. I'm going to teach you the dynamics of heat. You can get really close to the open flame on the stove and get your fingers warmed up." So that's understanding. Experience is don't touch the flame, it'll burn your hand. How did you navigate what I just said there, Cameron? Is that essentially what Marshall's saying there, or something different? Everybody experiences far more than they understand, yet it is experience rather than understanding that influences behavior.
That's actually a very important theme to him. It's something that Eliot talked about, and that he used to quote from Eliot. I believe in the Dante essay, Eliot says something like, poetry communicates before it's understood, something like that.
Yes.
And, in various ways, McLuhan repeated that for decades at the start of his career. The general idea there is that or I shouldn't say the general idea, I should say that what was interesting to McLuhan is that he was learning, especially from Richards and from Leavis and from Empson, that the whole art of the poet was in dealing with ambiguities. And the trick, you could say, of what was going on in poetry is that the ambiguities of poetry could be used to express things that didn't need to be understood to be learned, right? Or didn't need to be understood in sort of a conceptual sense in order to have some idea of what was going on in them. And so if you're going to ask what is communication, it was very important for McLuhan to wonder about what is it that goes on when something is communicated, but it's not understood in a conceptual sense. It may not even be understood in an experiential sense, like touching a flame or something, but nonetheless, communication happens. And to see the importance of that, just say, well, how does a child learn language? Right? Obviously, they don't learn language by already knowing it. Somehow the child learns language through its ignorance of language. Right? And so for McLuhan, what McLuhan is often trying to do is how are media able to communicate in ways that we have to differentiate from understanding them.
Really well put. Really quick. There's one line that always gets me too. In Cameron, and I'd love to hear your reaction or feelings on this line. Leo Bersani's Mallarmé study, he wrote, the very crises which threatens the writing of poetry sustains poetic composition.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, you could even go back to what Clinton was saying about hard and soft learning there. The poet needs to put something to paper, just like the artist needs to put something on the canvas, just like anybody has to make something of their life. The profound ways of putting something on paper or something on canvas or something in a life are all ways of not turning one's back on the problems at hand.
Mm.
Right? They're all ways of somehow expressing something that inherently involves the difficulties of doing them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. That resonates with me a lot. I mean, it seems to me like the idea for me has been that the artist is working through a problem in a way which, and I got this from reading Otto Rank actually. I read Otto Rank's Art and Artist, having been referred to by Ernest Becker's Denial of Death, and the notion is that the artist is someone who sees a hole in their own culture and a hole in themselves as an individual, and sort of through one motion fills both at the same time by externalizing for the rest of the society the solution they found for themselves, which is generalizable and outered or uttered for the rest of the culture, and that's how you solve the problem of attribution. If you look at a piece of art that's dug up in some archaeological dig and ask yourself, does this column represent Greek culture, or does it represent the person who that was right? How can art speak for a culture? Is it not just merely one artist doing their own thing? Do artists take credit, or do cultures take credit for their cultural productions, right? And so this is why that notion has always been profound to me, because it's sort of the artist assuming the labor on behalf of the larger group.
Yeah, so McLuhan often, it was more than often, over and over and over again, talked about the art of the Balinese, right? Where he said, we have no art, we just do everything as well as we can. So one of the things that distinguishes culture is when people have a framework that is generally believed and operates to answer their problems in a way that they don't find problematic. So nowadays we're at the opposite extreme of that. Everything is problematic, and we have no idea of what something would be like in order not to be problematic. So your question is one that is embedded in our culture, but in most other cultures in the history of the world, it couldn't be put, because the difference that you're citing there between the individual and the culture wouldn't hold.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. It's the fragmentary nature of a culture that that features individualism, that gives any meaning to the distinction, or gives any meaning to the distinction between art and separation. This is sorry, Gerry, go ahead.
Oh no, I was brilliant because we're trying to figure out where we heard this, Cameron, and you're sort of the source of where this came from. Somewhere Marshall said art is to show what the world is made of. And have you heard Marshall say that, or do you recall hearing that one?
I personally don't, but I would like to think that he said that, because I think it's an interesting thing for somebody like Marshall McLuhan to have said.
Yeah.
He was a little bit allergic to what might be called ontological statement, and it's something that I kind of miss in him, and I wish he had used ontological statement more, because I think it would have been helpful to his project. But that's that observation that art tells us what the world is made of. Notice that applies to almost any culture. It applies to our culture, where everything is fragmentary to the point of fragmenting itself to death, and it also applies to a culture where there is no difference between what the individual craftsperson is doing and the general understanding of their culture. And probably all human gestures can be fitted on a spectrum between those two things. Probably no such thing as a society in which there's only cohesion, and there's also no such thing as a society in which there is only fragmentation, right? So individuals are constantly involved in juggling those things, as is any society. And what makes societies different and what makes individuals different is the recipes, the concoctions, the compilations they come up with involving these things.
Mm-hmm. Well, yes. Well, that's extremely true. Once you take things multi-leveled, for instance, we have many different technical specialties, which inherently is a fragmentation, where someone has to rely on experts to fix their house for them, fix their car for them, do their taxes for them, etc., etc. I think this goes down to the substance of McLuhan's ancient quarrel in that regard, and yet nevertheless, people are well. Is it fair to say that when people are integrated, or when they have personal cohesion with a larger tribe, they are in a tribal sense, like these are maybe, they're posers, or they're clones or something, for in the language which where people who are striving to be individual deride people who are more conformist or whatnot, which is certainly getting things more to the ground of contemporary pop culture. Tribalism is sort of like the fragmentation of all the different groups which cohere within their subculture, right? Is that a good structure for looking at this? You think, is that useful, Cameron?
I'm not sure that I understood sort of where you were going with that. I have an idea of where you were trying to go. I would just say that it's not the case that in any society there is that any society lacks specialization. There's always people that can do things better than other people. There's always tasks that are done mostly by men or mostly by women or sometimes by children, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't think that specialization necessarily differentiates societies and individuals. It's the integration of the specialties that is the big thing, right? That's what's, just to try to bring this back to McLuhan a little bit, what he found so interesting in the what he called the electric age or the Marconi age was that the differences between the poles that we were speaking about earlier are inherently related. And when he looked at the Gutenberg galaxy, everywhere he saw things that were not inherently related. And so the question for him was, how do we go from a situation where things are not inherently related to one where it is? And the difficulty there is you cannot do that in linear fashion.
Right. There's a point, though, about specialization. However, I think because tasks and roles may have been specialized in a time where you could learn all there was to learn by the time you turned 10 or 11 or 12. You didn't have to, wash the laundry or go, work the field to know what that meant to wash the laundry or to work the field. Whereas in our heavily technical world today, there are entire facets of my basic material reality which are entirely closed off to me entirely. I don't know how my blender was made. I just know what button to push to make it, chop up my raspberries or what have you. The degree of complexity of technology as a runaway process has so complicated our world that I think McLuhan's focus on language is all to point out that that language is a large, internally consistent, coherent whole which has nothing new under the sun within its possible combinations and usages, but nevertheless specialist language and specialist jargon, and the fact that people have their own closed private languages when they talk shop in their given field has cut off resonant metaphors and meaning which absolutely do not transcend beyond their specialist uses. So it's not the specialists in an older society understood what the other specialists were doing. They just didn't do that job. Today, everyone is in a private alien world of knowing how to manipulate their small strata of the material world while having to, go try not to get ripped off by whoever is selling them the service to do the rest of the upkeep.
Right. But you see that there's a big problem there, Quentin, and that is that the mode of explanation that is typical of the Gutenberg galaxy and that is typical of literacy is linearity. And so what you do there is you construct a story that goes from simplicity or at least relative harmony, and then through invention it gets complex, and then those complexities sort of rebound on themselves, and we end up with a bunch of problems. But that is a Gutenberg story, right? And it's not one that McLuhan thought could be solved through evolution, right? So for him, evolution is typical of Gutenberg, and what it does is it forgets the missing link. So let's just go back for a minute to the 10-year-old that knows everything. That 10-year-old doesn't know what it is to live with a woman for a long time, or if the 10-year-old is a woman, what it means to live with a man for a long time. And maybe this is a society with several husbands or several wives or whatever, but that experience is necessarily outstanding. And similarly, they don't know what it's like for people to die. or they may know what it's like for some people to die, but they don't know what it's like for other people to die, ones that are alive with them now, and that they very definitely don't want them to die, but they're going to die, right? Or for people to get very sick, or for there to be some sort of earthquake, or a forest fire, or a epidemic, or. So the complexities of life are not the complexities of a bunch of machines that get built over time and gradually get more complex. The complexities of life are pretty much the same at all times, and they what's happened in modern life is that our any kind of integrated understanding of those things has broken down, and what McLuhan wanted to do was find out if there was a way back to an integrated understanding, and the media were a means of doing that.
All right. I have a lot to think about there. Gerry, did you want to hop in?
I wanted to go back for a second because one of our Finnegan's Wake Reading Club members once said, "Oh, I get what the wake is. It's a secret language you have with your brothers and sisters when you're 10 years old, so your parents don't know what you're talking about." And so that reminded me of, that's the age where we are. What are you going to be when you grow up, Clinton? That specialization is sort of what you're raised with. And this is one of the grand epiphanies that Bob taught me when we met many years ago. And he said, don't specialize. And I had already explored film, music, art, poetry, activism, and all these. And I wasn't in just one mode. So this whole thing of, when you were talking about specialization, that was really resonating with me, but it was more so drawing back a few steps with ambiguity in regards to intention. So a screenwriting teacher told me that great art is when you can clearly not see the intention of the maker. And Kubrick says the opposite. He says great film, great art is when you can clearly excuse me, I said it backwards. When you can, the screenwriting teacher said, when you can clearly see the intention of the maker. I flubbed, excuse me. Kubrick says the opposite. Great art is when you can clearly not see the intention of the maker. So, I'm curious, both of you, Cameron, what's your intention in probing and researching McLuhan? And what do you think his intention was? Did he have, we've talked about ambiguity a lot, but it seems as though he had intention, and it seems as though you have intention. What is that? How do you communicate that to me?
Sure. And in fact, you're going exactly where I wanted to go with a kind of apology, because it seems to me that if there is something about my work with McLuhan that I would say distinguishes it from other folks' work, it is by taking him to be talking about perennial problems and trying to figure out how perennial answers are broken down and how they can be reinstated. And it may be that in our conversation tonight, it may be that what I've done is I've kept trying to pull the conversation sort of in that direction of my presuppositions, and I'm sorry for that, but I don't know if I can do anything else.
No, that's fine. Stay where you're at, and we'll come where you're to.
Yeah, no, that's not a problem at all. But I would love you to suss out what you just said, Cameron, to take McLuhan, talk about answers and how they can be reinstated. You mean you want to talk about McLuhan, his proposed answers, and how we can reinstate McLuhan's answers? Is that what you're saying?
No. But just take a couple sort of obvious things that aren't talked about too much with McLuhan. One is his conversion in 1937, I guess it was. Or then there's his big family, 6 kids. These are things that McLuhan had in common with all kinds of folks, but he was very conscious of the stresses that were undermining religion and family in modern life. And so you can, once you're aware of those kinds of stresses, and I guess Clinton can probably see these things very clearly in his 1940s writings, you need to ask yourself, well, we've got all of these stresses. Do we have to find something new, or do we have to find new access to what's old? And I take McLuhan to be looking for new access to what's old.
Right. So you can see before his insights regarding the effects of the Gutenberg press, etc. He was fingering the breakdown of culture, which taught basic moral virtues and vices, and art which transcended class to cultivate just awareness of upright moral being, right? The breakdown of medievalism with the machinations of Machiavelli, and the same things everyone complains about, right? Industrialism and Rousseau's naive romanticism, and the Adam Smith's brutal hand of the market, etc., etc. Everyone was right. He was no different, except perhaps being more eloquent than many other people when examining what he was still comfortable considering to be something akin to the fall of man in the biblical sense of being kicked from the Garden of Eden. I guess he sort of began. Do you get that sense that he began with this sort of idealization of an age where lessons of moral virtue were taught, and eloquence and a well-rounded encyclopedic style of learning were expressly fostered within that culture? I mean, I'm trying to cram a lot into a small a few sentences here, right?
Yeah, but I think that's exactly what he didn't do. And if you just think about the term an ancient quarrel in modern America, his 1945 or 46, whenever it was, paper, which was sort of a continuation of his thesis, right?
Yep.
So, and the phrase an ancient quarrel also appears in the thesis. And what's interesting about the trivium, and what's interesting about the ancient quarrel that he talks about after the thesis, is that he does not imagine a time that was absent the quarrel. So it's being ancient it's being all at once. It's being always already there. Right, so there is no such thing as a life or a society without unbearable opacities, without unbearable pains of various sorts. So what's needed is we don't want to reconstitute something that never was. We don't want to find something that never will be. What we want to do is learn how to express ourselves, outer ourselves, in such a way that these things are not forgotten, but they're somehow forgiven between people, or even forgiven between parts of myself. And coming to terms with the difficulties of doing that is sort of McLuhan's take on the Western tradition.
Right. No, it's. I guess that's the meaning of the term perennial. They're always presentness. There's these points of balance he identifies in the thesis, though. Say with Abelard in the 12th century and Erasmus, at the dawn of like the Baroque period or the Renaissance. My dates might be a little bit hazy, but where it seems like things had just gone so far in one direction of the quarrel that now these actors started to run against the tide and fight to, restore the place of grammar now that the dialecticians have gone too far, or vice versa. These grammarians are talking nonsense. We have to start getting dialectical again. It's like these points of balance in what otherwise were, as he lays it out historically, in a linear sense, admittedly, this constant quarrel. Right, it's like a tug of rope. There are in fact times where in moving back and forth, the rope is equally balanced between the two teams. Right. I'm not sure if that was he really meant with his idea of jumping into the vortex and using the insight of the modernist poets as a means to try and strike a new balance or whatnot. But
But notice you were talking about the two ends of the tug rope, but McLuhan always talked, even at the very beginning of his life's work, he never talks about two things. He always talked about three things. And he came about this fairly honestly. His teacher at the University of Manitoba, Rupert Lodge, was a person who tried to bring forward the thesis that philosophy always takes one of three possible forms, but there is no such thing as a form that envelops those three. That philosophy always breaks down into one of the three, and that's as deep as it gets.
Oh.
And McLuhan, when McLuhan did his thesis, 10 or 12 years, his PhD thesis, 10 or 12 years after working with Lodge, then he repeats this threefold. So it's not the case that at any given point in time, there is a balance between the two things. Rather, balance is one of the three. And what distinguishes one time from another is simply the stresses between the three things, right? Of which balance is one.
Gerry.
So then he, and that relates to what we were saying between the anode and the cathode, is that what is different about what happens in the Second World War and after the Second World War with cybernetics and with the birth of computing and stuff, is that human beings come to a sense of how the balance between the poles can be put to use in ways that had never been seen before. And so for McLuhan, there is a kind of moment where he sees that the different stresses between the three have suddenly come to be the engine of modern media and of the modern economy, in the form of the electric, how can I put this, the principle of the electric, the principle of the bit, right? Where you have two poles, but you have a variable relation between the poles as the third. And so what he finds is that, oh, there's a way of dealing with these problems that I've had since 1930, namely the interplay of the three. It turns out that that's the very motor of modern times. And so now what I want to be able to do is use that motor to talk about these perennial problems.
Mm-hmm.
I know that was very unclear. Sorry.
Well, no,
Oh, no, that was Cameron. That was beautiful. It really got to the meat of what I was trying to ask about intention. But, this word stress, words evoke more in their meaning. And I did learn, the word that really stuck out a lot, what you just said was, so not forgotten, but forgiven. And Bob worked with these people called the Evergreens, and they had this thing that forgiveness is the key. And that always stood out for me. And I'm fond of Mark Twain saying that, forgiveness is the smell that the flower releases when the foot crushes the flower, something like that. And it's a beautiful statement. But in this day and age, and I'd say the times we're talking about, older times, past times, that accountability is this important word when it comes to forgiving. Oh, well, I'll forgive you. Can you forgive the sin and the sinner? And I'll forgive you, but you have to be held accountable. So, and Marshall said that, why must we continue to mow down the Kennedys? I sort of love that line because it engages people in a question. It's not Marshall telling you. But my question, or what I'm sort of probing constantly, is, okay, you have forgiveness, you have stress, you have forgiveness, then you have accountability, but does punishment work? Like, what works? If you're going to have accountability, you're going to forgive. They go, well, accountability means punishment. Does that work?
Right. But you could say that Finnegan's Wake is the story of how nothing works.
Yeah.
Right. It's not as if people know how to bring up children, or how to live with a spouse, or how to decide what to do with their life, or whether to go left or whether to go right. These things are never decided in advance, and they're never decided right. And so the whole idea of there being punishment that works is, it strikes me as, a kind of a joke, right?
Yeah.
Anybody that's had to deal with a child knows that there's no such thing as things working. The only thing there is things working out, working through.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. To kind of spin it into your innate versus invented paradigm there, Gerry, it makes me think that if we've been talking about learning happening through experience, then punishment is an invented artificial experience for the sake of creating learning here, which actually ties into my whole idea of if we're going to talk about these life problems, these perennial problems, which we'll always deal with, and which transcend any particular time or any particular culture, like you said, you just rattled them off there, Cameron. There's a sort of universal nature to knowing how to raise kids, or knowing how to choose what to do, this sort of thing. But I always do like to go back to the material nature of our present technological state, and why it is McLuhan stressed that the new technology becomes the new environment, and it is invisible, and why it is that everyone's engaged in the old mirage of the old world, which is being performed or put on by the new environment, just because that's the only way that it can catch on and spread medically, right? Like, people don't buy a technology until it's marketed to be easy to use, and then it's easy to use because it evokes some familiar pattern they already have. And that's why this whole tetrad dynamic thing works as, what are the commodities that catch on and become ubiquitous in tomorrow's future environments? So that's why I always like to dial it back to specialization, and particularly technical specialization. Because that's like the new dimension, which might not have existed in slower moving times, where myths could sustain a culture for just, generations, until there was some, catastrophe, like a flood happens and now you have to go move somewhere else. Like, apparently Egypt was pretty slow moving compared to our times, and they of course would have dealt with all the perennial issues that which we could learn from today insofar as lifestyle, but our environment's really weird right now. And that's a very new, sudden phenomenon in the larger historical scope.
Right. So McLuhan often talked about living 100 years or living 1,000 years in a week or something like that, right?
Yeah.
And there's certainly something to that, but for McLuhan, these things have an optional aspect to them, right? We choose, or we do things to ourselves which could be the result of choices, but we don't make the choice. We just do them.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so what McLuhan wants to be able to do is he wants to be able to look at what's going on and ask, how did we get here? And did we need to do that?
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
You could say he wants to dial back. This is something that Bob talks about all the time, right? Changing the media temperature for whole societies or something. I disagree with Bob that that was a kind of a technological fix that McLuhan wanted. I think what McLuhan was talking about was us becoming conscious of what we're doing to ourselves and then deciding if that's a good thing or a bad thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There's nothing fated. There's nothing that we just sort of find ourselves in the midst of with all of these new inventions and the fast pace of life and all of this sort of stuff that we tell ourselves. Those are all choices.
That sort of opens me up to relate something that's very close to my actual experience, and that is, the way that social media companies disclaim any awareness of what it is they were doing. Oh, we made a mistake and now there's fake news, or what have you. Oh, we didn't know what we were doing. And yet when Facebook and Twitter were brand new, I had been on the internet for a long time, and we were all saying this is a terrible idea. You don't want corporations to run your websites. No, get rid of these awful corporate web forums. This is going to be terrible. They only care for money. They're stealing your data. They're just going to manipulate you, right? There's always a loud vocal contingent of Cassandras whose warnings, go unheeded because they are not in the reins of power to go say, Facebook's a bad idea, don't make it. Twitter's an awful idea, don't make it. Smartphones are terrible casino slot machines that are going to turn your brains into mush, don't buy them, right? I was one of those people saying, this is an awful idea, you guys don't know what you're doing. And now I get to go read in the New York Times about how, we didn't know what we were doing, right? We had no idea the world we were creating. Well, shut up. You just ignore them all to cash in, right? So yes, there always is this consciousness, but how it's
let's look at the different aspects of what you're saying there. First, the people saying that we need to slow down, we need to be more conscious of our choices, we need to be careful about innovation. These are very, very, very old things. There were Greek philosophers that were saying stuff like that, for example. So it's certainly true that Wyndham Lewis and McLuhan foresaw very, very clearly some of the problems that would emerge from, international broadcasting and satellites and all of this sort of stuff. So of course, these things were foreseen, and there were people saying that they could be problematic. But the problem with these things is not that their downside is not foreseen. The problem is that we don't have a framework for evaluating what people can see. Right? So it's there's always going to be people that see the upside, the downside, and all this stuff. There's always going to be people that want to make a buck on the back of new technology. But what is missing, and what you can say is consciously missing in the American environment, is the idea that there's something about human life that demands that these things be studied and submitted to a social understanding of what's good for us all. Right? That is what is missing. And for McLuhan, an understanding media poses exactly that question. Right? It's not a question of understanding. Understanding media isn't understanding what's inside the box. It isn't even what's understanding what the cause is going to be. It's understanding what the conditions would be like that would be able to turn this stuff to life.
That's interesting, because it immediately brings to mind, the computer joke that it's not a bug, it's a feature. And so if television turns everyone into a very suggestible sort of role player who is involved in mimicking the broad marketing categories who are sold to them, I mean, that's a feature to the person who wants to go sell surfboards to everybody who wants to identify with that lifestyle, right? So is having people, what's good for people? Is it being
right?
I guess
that when a society breaks down, the tools to answer that sort of question break down. That's what the breakdown is, right? So it's not as if there's an obvious answer to that, and we just have to trot it out. There is no obvious answer to that, and that's what serious people are looking for.
I can give you a good example. Cameron, that was really good. I like what you just said, because I met a gentleman once and I said, oh yeah, come to our McLuhan discussion group. He goes, oh, I love Marshall McLuhan. He hated TV, and I never watched TV my whole life. And I go, well, I don't know if he hated TV. He wanted to study its effects. And he goes, I don't watch TV. I goes, well, what if you were going to watch Marshall McLuhan on TV talking about TV? Would you make an exception then?
That's a good point. In fact, I wanted to say to Clinton earlier that although it's true that television can be seen as producing these negative effects, for McLuhan, the fact that we had learned to objectivize our sensorium, that is to say that we could actually make a machine where there was sound and vision, and then there was a cohesion between these, which he called tactility. The television, in this sense, was the precondition of answering these questions about media that we've been discussing. So television can be stultifying, but it can also lead to new questions and new knowledge. So what McLuhan was constantly trying to do was tease these things apart and see if there wasn't a good direction for them.
Yeah. Gerry, go ahead.
Oh, that was amazing because Cameron, you really get this series, McLuhan-MashUp, with Clinton and I are trying to do. You put that in layperson's terms. They could understand. That last line is just like, could be a neon sign over a TV station. But it brought up this thing I wanted to talk about for a second perfectly. You must have ESP because Mary Catherine Bateson just died, or a bit in the New York Times, January 19th. She's her Gregory Bateson's her dad. Margaret Mead's her mom. She, wrote an important book where life as an improvisatory art. That's what we're doing. We're doing improv here. If you saw the great piece on Mike Nichols today on CBS, it really showed you how much improv was invented by him and Elaine May. And improv is an important thing, and that's what we're doing. And I really appreciate both of you being here in improvising. But here's the line, because you just said objectivity. She said, she's in a situation with two very complicated people. Here's the quote. One of the preliminaries of our household, in which I grew up on, was that there was no clear line between objectivity and subjectivity, that observation does not preclude involvement. What do you think she was saying there, Cameron? Because I find that a little confusing, but because you brought up this you objectified our sensorium, that TV objectified our sensorium. Can you navigate what I just babbled on?
Well, it goes back to the hard learning and soft learning that Clinton brought up a while back. It's not the case that somebody can feel themselves forward entirely lacking a framework. Everybody always has a framework. There's always a ground to our figure. There's always a medium or media that are always already there. So the whole question of objectivity and subjectivity is one that can be posed rigidly only in Gutenberg galaxy terms. In terms of anode cathode, they are in resonance, as McLuhan often said.
That makes me immediately think, is not the framework, the initial framework, our exceptions, of course, accounted for, our human bodies and their sensory inputs? We have two arms and two legs, and we feel and we see and we hear, and our nature as embodied animals with these faculties, which then integrate subjectively, right? So before we get to having a conceptual framework, before we get to having a calendar year or recognizing cyclical seasons or whatnot, at the very least, it's we learn that we have bodies and hands and fingers, and we see things in light and we don't in dark, right? That's a framework to begin with, which is very helpful when in our cognitive science language today, they tend to overemphasize the nature of chaos, how everything is chaos first, right? And then, we have to order it somehow, but it's really not chaos. So it starts off very, confined to these particularities of being human subjects at the human scale, right? Our bodies concept?
No, of course not. But it's also not the case that bodies make us who we are. Right? For McLuhan, there is no such thing as human beings without language. And language is already a medium. In fact, it's the medium. So it's not the case that you just have people. You have bodies which are able to make noises, and somehow noises can make sense in a way that they can't for any other animal, as far as we know. So what this gets back to the ancient quarrel idea. For McLuhan, like his teacher Rupert Lodge, you can never break down the threefold into the onefold. It's not the case that the onefold of materiality evolves into the threefold of whatever. Instead, as soon as there are humans, there's the threefold that's there, but it's a genuine threefold. That is to say, it's a genuine quarrel where no one of the three can ever prevail over the other two.
I just like to point out, because you said it so succinctly, that when you say words are these sounds that make sense, it's not just in the colloquial sense of, that makes sense as in like I understand that, or that's coherent, but it makes sense insofar as words can in their own way somehow reproduce it in the listener's imaginations, the entire effects of experiencing the sensorium, if the words are well handled, oratorily, poetically, etc. Right?
Yes, but whenever I think about this stuff, I always think about the child learning language, and I can't imagine that when humans first spoke, that it was any too different from when a child first learns language. And I don't believe that a child has a very complicated conceptual apparatus that is set in motion by these things. It's mimetic. It's something that seems to be inborn to humans, that they can catch on to these things. But
I know I'd counter that. Kids say the darndest things. Art Linkletter. I mean, children are extremely poetic, even at a young age, even if they're wrong about what they think is going on.
Sure. But you're talking about like age 4 or 5, and I'm talking about age 1.5.
Okay.
There's a big difference there. So I'm just talking about when kids learn language, or when human beings first began to use language. I doubt very much that there was complicated senses going on in the way that you were talking about them, but there were complicated things going on, right? I'm not denying the complication, right? There's two separate people, and there's a sound that goes between them. And that sound that goes between them somehow means something to the hearer that was intended by the speaker. So hand me the meat, or if you're going to fart, go out of the house, or whatever, right? And they get it. And so this idea of getting it is very closely involved with McLuhan's thoughts about media, and it goes back to when we were talking about how things can mean when we don't understand them. And of course, when when humans first began to talk, or when a child is first learning to speak, they, of course, they don't understand, because the language that they are going to learn is that medium through which understanding will come to be.
Now, there's something that's fantastic. Oh, I just like to say one thing.
Go ahead.
Gerry.
Yeah, go ahead.
The idea is, when there's something to be gotten in the communication, I intend for you to know this thing, and so I will speak to you to, right? There's a implicit, it would be easy for a lay listener to bring in these sort of Shannon Weaver style assumptions about there being a message to be communicated, and crossing this gap through the channel of voice and losing, but that's a very Gutenberg send a letter, receive a letter technological way of viewing communication, when especially when we talk about the Marconi galaxy, or we talk about McLuhan's conception of the tribalism, or Ted Carpenter's. It's not at all about, well, I can't say not at all, but the intention, the idea of having an idea that you want the other person to get isn't the whole of the story, right? It's more like conveying through mimesis the experience of desiring the meat, or being, revolted by the fart.
Yeah. So there's an interesting parallel between what we're talking about here and what we were talking about a little earlier, when we were talking about the breakdown in our society of knowing what it would be like to decide that something is good or bad, right? We've lost that facility, and it's instead of that facility being something fairly obvious and something very important, it's become political and a matter of power, and the way that it's kind of evolved for us is a symptom of the problem rather than how it could ever be solved, right? So when we're talking about humans communicating, what we're talking about is an environment in which the sounds and gestures kind of fit into a pattern that we really don't understand, but that we have this suspicion that what's going on sort of behind the scenes is very, very important. And if we could understand that, we might be able to fabricate it in a good sense for our society now.
Gerry, go ahead.
Yeah, that was great, because Cameron, you must have ESP. As soon as you said farting, somehow I farted, and thank God Zoom is not in smell-o-vision. That's a service of Zoom. and so really evoked was T.S. Eliot saying they had the experience, but they missed the meaning. That's what I was hearing you were saying. So, and it was thank
God, right?
Yeah. It was in a real wild film that came out the same year as Finnegan's Wake, 1939, Jean Renoir's The Rules of the Game, where Octave, one of the characters, actually the character that Renoir plays, says, she's a society woman, and society has strict rules. And then this astute article in the New York Times recently said, how the characters observe those rules, or rather bend them without breaking them, becomes the movie's through line. So, that's an interesting phenomenon of breaking the rules or bending the rules.
Yeah, you can't have rules without concepts. Go ahead, Cameron.
Well, I mean, when you talk about bending the rules or breaking the rules, you've already started with some notion of what the rules are, right? Yeah. So you might say that what we're trying to do is we're trying to go from a situation where rules either are maintained or they're broken, and that either or is typical of the Gutenberg galaxy, and we're trying to get a notion of rules that bend. And in some of our new logics and some AI and some searches that are not hard and fixed, then we're kind of feeling our way towards that, right? But it's the difficult thing about the new environment that we're looking for is that if it's not analog, then it can't be reached in steps. It has to be always already there in some sense. And so how do we get to what's always already there, but is unknown, or is worse than unknown, is shat on, is prevented from coming to fruitful presence? Those are the kinds of questions that I think McLuhan was kind of wrestling with, and that in most McLuhan scholarship I miss.
Right, and thank God you're there with McLuhan's New Sciences, because Cameron, I turn to that constantly for enlightenment. And it was Max Planck who said science cannot solve the ultimate mystery of nature, because in the last analysis, we are part of the mystery we are trying to solve. So why did you call it McLuhan's New Sciences? I just love that title. And I was just wondering, what'd you do? Sit down and make a list of what I could call this? And how'd you come up with those magic words?
Actually, the story was much more prosaic than that. I was working with people in WordPress, and they said, "Well, all right, we're gonna need a name for this thing because we're gonna need to find out if the URL is available, and then if it is available, we're gonna have to nail it down. So what do you want to do?" And basically, within seconds, I said, "Well, let's call it McLuhan's New Sciences," because I had always thought that if McLuhan's work could develop into a new science, then it would inherently develop into new sciences in the same way that chemistry in the course of the 19th century became organic chemistry and new forms of medicine and all sorts of new sciences that were kind of, they were old sciences like geology, but they were refashioned by chemistry. And the same thing happened to genetics in this century, or in the last century. So science inherently meant to me, science is plural.
Yeah, it's beautiful because, we know the laws of media is the new science. That's singular, right? And you put a plural on it. So that was important.
Mm-hmm. You're much more grounded in philosophy than I am, Cameron. So I guess McLuhan is trying to be an empiricist. Is that the right term for his science? Is precisely an empirical one?
Well, he's certainly somebody that wants to pay attention to fact and not to betray fact, not to ignore fact. But within philosophy, what exactly empiricism is highly contentious. And I think most philosophers wouldn't recognize McLuhan as an empiricist. That's empiricism is a kind of label, is in modern times is fairly closely associated with materialism, but then there are empiricists that deny materialism. So what you're addressing there is a complex question, but it's important for McLuhan in the sense that his most important teacher when he was an undergrad, was a philosopher. That philosopher, Rupert Lodge, wanted McLuhan to become a philosopher. McLuhan wrote articles for Lodge that Lodge apparently said he could get published if McLuhan wanted them to be published. When McLuhan applied for a job at the University of Wisconsin from Cambridge, he included 2 of his essays that he had written for Lodge in his application. And that's because we have that application, because that application is in the Ottawa papers, then we have the 2 essays that he did for Lodge in Ottawa there.
Oh, brilliant.
So what I'm trying to say there is that McLuhan was very much tempted by philosophy, but as he would later say in the 1950s, he felt constrained by philosophy in a way that he didn't in terms of literature. And so he opted for literature as a way of sort of extending himself over a broader field.
Right. Okay. I've been saying something lately in conversations which I've been trying to communicate something about McLuhan regarding philosophy as a subject matter, and maybe you can tear me apart on this. I'd really appreciate it. But the way I've been describing it is that McLuhan is rather outside the history of ideas structure of philosophy, at least as I've encountered it as embodied by my friends who do in fact study philosophy as a formal field, right? But there's this implicit idea that within the history of ideas, we go from, to pick an arbitrary starting point, you go from Descartes through Kant, through Hegel, and then Nietzsche, and then Marx, or I got that backwards, but you see what I mean. And then it all culminates in Heidegger, and then nobody knows where to go after that, or some approximation of that story, right? And I think McLuhan was just seemed to, through his art analysis and his study of the composition of writing of Shakespeare and Pope and Dryden and Jane Austen, even especially. And Henry James, the novelist, William James's brother, right? So McLuhan has this sort of parallel history of what it is philosophy tries to get at, but just through these different thinkers. Is that what do you think of that summation? Because I'm usually talking to people who know Hegel and Kant and don't know anything about art history, right?
I think it's important to start with McLuhan studying at the University of Manitoba with Rupert Lodge, and Rupert Lodge has this trifold idea of what philosophy is. Idealism, realism, and pragmatism were the 3 forms that he saw philosophy always expressing. So, and one of the people that McLuhan read with Lodge and that was influential for the rest of his life was Whitehead, and specifically Whitehead's book, Science in the Modern World. And one of the interesting things about Science in the Modern World is that over and over and over again, Whitehead talks about, the spirit of an age, or the assumption of Descartes, or the idea of Hegel, or all this sort of stuff. And it's easy to imagine McLuhan saying to himself as he's reading this stuff, well, wait a minute, we've got ages, we've got ideas, we've got presuppositions, we got assumptions, we got, there must be 1,000 different sort of categories of thought in Whitehead. But then you can see McLuhan saying, well, but do these background shaping influences, do they come in certain flavors? And one answer to the flavors they come in could be the 3 forms of Rupert Lodge, or it could be the 3 forms of McLuhan's thesis. But what he's but when he comes to Cambridge, what he learns is that the complications of language are far greater than what he had supposed. And so it isn't just a question of sort of looking at a poem and saying, oh, that's idealism, or that's realism, or that's pragmatism, right? Or that's dialectics, and that's rhetoric, and that's grammar. Mm-hmm. Instead, he learns from these people at Cambridge that there's very complicated things going on in the use of language, where what is communicated isn't just a matter of words lined up on a page that you read and come to understand. There's something else. Mm-hmm. And so when McLuhan is trying to think through, okay, how do I look at things so that I recognize them for what they are? That's the question that gets answered, for example, by the trivium, dialectic, rhetoric, and grammar. Right? I can type things in that way. But once I've typed them, how do they work? What's going on here? And that's the media question. Right? And that's more or less what his life is about. What's going on in his head is, if I can find a way to categorize everything that is expressed and then understand how those categories work, then I may be able to take ancient wisdom and rejuvenate it. Right? And that's what he wanted to do in religion. That's what he wanted to do in his family. That's what he wanted to do in his academic life.
Mm-hmm. God, Gerry, yeah, that's profound. Thanks.
In studying James Joyce and Finnegan's Wake, I would say that Marshall was influenced by Joyce and the Wake. And that's what Joyce was trying to do, I think, in a lot of ways, was take ancient wisdom and rejuvenate it. Would you say that, Cameron?
Yes, but I don't pretend to be a profound student of the Wake. I'm not. I've never even read most of the Wake.
I know. We were trying to get you to drive from Orange County to Venice to just experience it once. But someday join us online, because now all the Wake reading clubs are online and it's sort of fun. But I'm not saying you need to. I think your knowledge is much more comprehensive than just, relying on saying, hey, Marshall got a lot. There was this whole thing in our group where Bob would call people failed McLuhanites. Hugh Kenner's a failed McLuhanite. Why? Well, because they don't get Finnegan's Wake. So we said, well, that's a little elitist to say, Bob. Could you word it differently? And he goes, yeah, call them non-Finneganese McLuhanites. And it's so good because, a lot of the MEA people are non-Finneganese McLuhanites. And it's like, just try it once, just get a little feel for it. But I was wondering and that was so well put, Cameron, it's really been a pleasure. I was wondering if you could distinguish between flavors and fragments. You brought up that word flavors, and this is again turning to French film theorist Andre Bazin, who wrote about the rules of the game. And he said the director, quote, uncovered the secret of a film form that would permit everything to be said without chopping the world up into little fragments that would reveal the hidden meanings in people and things without disturbing the unity natural to them. So he says fragments there. You said flavors. Is that somewhat resonate?
Yes, but he's saying without breaking them up into pieces that would no longer work or something. And I was talking about flavor as being what a filmmaker like Renoir could achieve, right? So it's not strictly comparable. But I like what you read there, and I think that is what a interesting person tries to do. That's what an interesting person tries to do with their art. That's what an interesting person tries to do with their life. That's where it's at.
Well, Clinton, that's where it's at is quite the cliche to end on.
I think that's perfect.
That's perfect. But I do want to compliment you both. And if you have any closing statements, that's where it's at, Cameron. It was pretty dang brief and right up McLuhanMashUp's philosophy. But I wanted to say how I'm always fond of something that Bob taught me well is that saying aphorisms, anecdotes, asides is cute, but how do we reinvent them? So, Andy Warhol said, in the future, everyone will be famous for 15 minutes. And Bob would say, in the future, everyone will have privacy for 15 minutes. So I, in honor of this amazing 2 hours with you two gentlemen, I immensely thank you from my heart and soul for this enlightening time. Dr. Astro Teller said that AI is the science of how to get machines to do the things they do in the movies. And so I reworded it and I flipped it. Instead of AI, I call it IA, integral awareness, inclusive awareness, is the science of how to get machines to do the things they do in McLuhanMashUps.
Yeah, that's pretty good.
Perfect. All right. Thanks a lot, gentlemen. Awesome. And enjoy the rest of